literature review, and that concerns what is and what isn't, quote, adaptive. As with many things in many fields, a new trend, a new exciting topic carries with it quite a bit of misunderstanding, and the need to be very specific about what we're referring to when we use a term like adaptive management. And so there are two basic definitions that we have here. The first basic definition is, I think, the one that's used in about 99% of cases, and that's reacting to changes in the operating environment. And these can be changes. They can be changes in the operating environment, or it can be new information that a program team or other staff picks up in the course of doing their work. And that's essentially being open to the possibility that the original plan was conceived without a sufficient amount of information, or that changing circumstances and market dynamics, for example, have required a change in plan. And that's good. But there are other fields that we were looking into, and for a great review of the one for natural resource management, you can look at a paper recently put out by Matt Ripley. That takes the definition a bit further and says, sure, it's great to be flexible. It's great to react to new information. But in order to be truly adaptive, we need to be purposefully experimental. We need to have a specific idea about what it is we want to learn in the next set of interventions, and set up a monitoring regime that allows us to be able to track that information in short, iterative loops. And so a better definition is purposefully experimenting to answer questions that are critical to the achievement of results. As I said, about 99% of how we use the term in development refers to the basic definition. And for the purpose of this discussion, we are generally going to use the term adaptive management to refer to just simply reacting to changes in the operating environment or new information. And at the end, we'll come back to what it would look like if we started to instead shift our attention to a purposeful experimentation and iterative process of discovery as we gradually learn to be more effective in our operating environment. So moving forward, we categorized all the findings of this report into four basic buckets. That's knowledge, leadership, culture, and rules. Now, when we first started, we had only three buckets. We had knowledge, culture, and rules. And in the course of doing the research, we added leadership because we felt that the overwhelming influence on both political leadership at a very high level and then practical leadership at the field level warranted separate treatment. And so you'll find that discussed here shortly. And so then, because we don't have a whole lot of time, we have to move relatively quickly. Without further ado, we'll go ahead and jump into the findings. So, looking at knowledge. So, one of I think actually the most commonly cited constraint to our ability to manage adaptively is a lack of understanding across the board. And this includes technical staff such as myself, contracts, procurement, mission directors. It's basically everybody. A lack of very, very specific knowledge about the rules, about what the rules actually tell us. And when we encounter ambiguity in whether or not something is permissible, we tend, the vast majority of the time, to default to the most conservative interpretation of the rules. So we default to risk aversion and restriction. And this was surprising to us as like such a simple thing that was so incredibly influential in the pursuit of adaptive programming. But there it is. It was universally agreed upon, almost universally agreed upon, by all the interviewees that we discussed the topic with. So, all right. So that's dealing with what the rules actually on this topic in the report. But again, for the purpose of the short time period that we have, I'm just going to move forward relatively quickly. And so on the other side of the bucket of knowledge, you have understanding the context. And so the first distinction was knowing what the rules actually say, and then there are various aspects of understanding the context that are relevant to the quantitative information, in which the decision makers at progressively higher levels of authority have an increasing preference for sort of non-narrative numbers to simply be able to check very quickly what's going on with a diverse portfolio of activities for which they're responsible beneath them. They don't have a lot of time for long pull reports. They don't have a lot of time to ingest the nuanced qualitative information that actually says a lot more about what is going on with the program and gives them the information that they need to be able to make decisions that are supportive of an adaptive environment. Another thing that came out was that there are varying levels of acceptability of different kinds of changes. And so donors are okay with program changes that are a response to significant and obvious changes in the context, but they're less accepting of changes that result from experimentation and iteration. So if I go back to a donor, if I'm running a program and go back to a donor and say, okay, I just want you to know that we're changing X intervention because when we tried it, we realized that there was a lot we did not know. I'm just saying that people are having some sound issues. I hope that everyone is okay. Sarah, let me know if there's an issue that I need to address over at this end. So yeah, donors tend to find it. Okay, donors tend to find it more acceptable to request a change if we come back and say the market changed on us than if we come back and say there are many things that we simply did not know and that we now know because we started intervening and therefore we want to make these changes. But the vast majority of the changes that we would request are changes that result from our increased understanding, our improved understanding of the context that results from our intervention, and not simply from fundamental, easily evidenced changes in market dynamics. So that's a problem. Another problem is an underinvestment in results management, which is largely seen as an overhead cost instead of a vital aspect of programming. And then the last one is there is a widespread dissatisfaction with the log frame as a tool for as sort of the basic orienting tool for a program. And we think this probably comes down to the fact that we're trying to do two things at once with the log frame. One is it's a mechanism for accountability, and on the other hand, it describes a theory of change. The theory of change is going to adjust itself over the course of programming. The mechanism for accountability could be reasonably the same if we can stay away from outputs and be focused mostly on outcomes. And so as we're thinking about what to do as a result of this report, one of the things that we should keep in mind is whether we can develop a new tool or whether we need to develop two new tools that meet each of these separate needs and move beyond the notion that we can accomplish both a mechanism for accountability and an embodiment of an overarching theory of change for a program with the same document. Moving forward to the question of leadership. So we divided into political leadership and practical leadership. So again, the reason that we treat this separately is that leadership allows for and personifies adaptive management, or it doesn't. As Karri is going to discuss in a moment under the area of culture, culture is non-transferable. It can't be developed with a toolkit or a framework. You can't just walk in and drop it down in a program and boom, have an adaptive culture. And leadership probably plays one of the most influential roles in creating and sustaining that culture and giving permission for people to be adaptive, to admit failures, to discuss challenges. And so under political leadership, one of the biggest constraints to adaptive programming is an emphasis on the burn rate. And this, as governments have moved into periods of austerity with ring-fenced overseas development budgets and very active national media, that's become more and more of a pressure for market development programs under several different donors. And then the other one, again, as mentioned previously, is an emphasis on easily communicated results. The need to be able to give a few numbers that an extremely busy higher level manager within a donor structure or the authorizing authorities such as the U.S. Congress that provides the money in the first place, something that's easy for them to ingest. So looking on to the issue of practical leadership, so we've got some basic consensus at this point about the personal qualities of leadership that inspire adaptive programming. We discussed a little bit of that in the report. There's quite a bit of other research that's been done. but they include things like an insistence on substantive engagement by all staff, an open embrace of failure personified by leadership, an ability to create the incentives for internal reciprocity and integration, celebration of staff who are willing to bring bad news to the boss. Whenever you find a staff member who is willing to call out the boss in a meeting and and say we need to rethink how we're doing these things, that person should get a medal. And so there's some common agreement about these personal qualities, but there's another huge constraint from the political leadership, and that is the churn, the 2 to 4 year churn that through a series of key positions that tends to dampen enthusiasm for adaptation because one can never know what the next leader is going to expect, right? So, and this happens at the donor level, particularly in country missions, and it happens at the program level in program leadership positions, and then in the supervisors of the leaders of programs. And so when the problem essentially comes down to if you're sort of implementing level staff, whether in the donor structure or on the program itself, and you're taking risks and you're adapting and you're trying to find ways to be flexible within your understanding of the rule structure, but you have no idea whether the boss that comes in next is going to appreciate that, and you can't establish a bulletproof paper trail to support your opinion, then you're going to go back to that previously discussed knee-jerk reaction to a conservative interpretation of options and dampen the room that there is for adaptive management within a program. And so that's I think worthy of highlighting is the basic, as we quoted one respondent in the report, the basic career requirement of some positions to burn the house down and rebuild it with your own name on it when you walk in. Karri?
Everyone, can we get the next slide? Ashley, can we get the next slide? Thanks. There we go. Right. So really, when we're looking at culture, it's important to understand that there are actually kind of 3 or 4 levels of culture. There's the office culture, what it's like with the people you work with directly. There's the organizational culture. Each individual organization or company will have their own way of being. And then there's a national culture, whatever country you're in, and how people understand and relate to that. Occasionally, leaders are able to, even inside an office, they'll create a project culture as well. So you can see as many as 4 different layers. And as Tim was already talking about with regards to leadership, it has a lot to do with the individual personalities. And it's not easy to, you can't do it with a toolkit. So this is something that gets very much into trust and how that relationship is built within an organization. What are the leaders saying to the staff? What is the donor saying to the staff? What are the relationships between them? And the key question here becomes which behaviors are rewarded and which are sanctioned. What are people actually getting encouraged to do? And then you start getting into the question of meeting our objectives and burn rates as building a different kind of culture on a project than program quality in different ways. So we recognize that element becomes key in how adaptive a project can actually be, and the communication and trust being key also in the adaptation. And we'll move on to rules. I'll start talking about rules. There we go. So this section on rules, and at one point it was called the operations section, it's really, it very much echoes the knowledge section. We're understanding that often our contract structures, our finance payment systems, our compliance folks, they are what program people would perceive as placing a limit on how adaptive things can be. But as we already touched on in the knowledge piece, it's not that the rules actually limit it, it's how we understand it may indeed be what's limiting it, or our willingness to take the broad definition as opposed to the conservative definition. So we really need to be increasing the leaders, the group of leaders in our organizations and on our teams who are thinking in the more open, adaptive ways. Now, this, Tim said the other topic was the most frequently mentioned. I would say that the HR was probably the other most frequently mentioned issue, in that both donors and implementers equally complained about how leadership, donors want a wider pool, a bigger pool to hire, to have leading their programs, and implementers want to put a wider group of people, a wider skill set in front of donors, but are afraid to do that because of the specifications that come from donors. Donors are saying, "Well, put somebody else in front of us. We're going on what we know works, but we're open to other things." So that's an example of where I think we actually agree on the problem, and that's a good thing, because then that means we can find a way to fix it. And there were a number of those kinds of issues as we went through the research overall, that in fact donors and implementers completely agree on the problem. And now we need to get down to the work of finding the trust between both sides, or the mechanism for just solving the problem. I think moving on to contract features, this is another area where there is a lot of room for discussion. I mean, we all understand the reasons why contracts need to be clear, and that can be hard when you're trying to do adaptive programming. However, there are a lot of different things that are being tried right now. Inception periods are one, payment by results are another, the way we partner with private sector actors. All of these are starting to emerge as different promising practices. And I think the key thing here is for the program and the technical people to really engage the contracts, the compliance, the procurement, the finance folks from the earliest possible point, because it is possible that agreement can be built, and that the structures which need to be there don't have to be a barrier. But we do have to change approach, which is not to see these folks as part of the problem, but actually seek them for information on how to be part of the solution. Because they, just like the program staff, those operations folks, see it as their job to look after the organization. And so we need to start seeking solutions where both a solution where the program staff can get the flexibility they need while protecting and supporting the intent of the contracts and the finance schedules and these kinds of things. Obviously, all of this is linked to culture and knowledge of the rules, and it became very hard at times to pull the pieces of the basket apart. And I'll just move on to the next slide, which is our conclusions and recommendations. Overall, I think not just the team that worked on this, but I think what we're hearing widely is that there's a real desire for hypothesis-based planning. That means moving, for some people, that means moving away from log frames and moving towards different tools like results chains. An important piece of that is separating, as Tim was saying, separating out the mechanisms for accountability from the other functions of the log frame, and really finding a way to be able to express the final outcome that you want and the multiple pathways to that final outcome. SDC has developed a guide, which provides some great guidance on how to navigate existing rules and tools. I think other donors are also trying to do that, trying to find the guidance for their staff. It's worth it for implementers to understand this too, because I think it gives a level of comfort in interpreting different rules. And really, as I've kind of already said, another strong recommendation is to involve the procurement and contracts and finance folks much earlier on than program and technical staff often do. And then the next slide, over to you, Tim.
Right. So, so lastly, just to round us out, one of our recommendations was focusing on indicators at higher levels of market and systems change, or allowing for there to be a variety of different outputs for the same outcome. And so, if we are going to insist on sticking with the log frame, or regardless, we need to maintain some tool for accountability and program performance. That the accountability needs to be focused at the outcome level, giving us the freedom to be able to try a variety of different approaches to achieve similar results. And another one, recognizing that this is going to be a bit controversial, but I'm sure that there are a lot of donor field staff who are very quietly saying amen to the idea of reducing donor field staff responsibilities and allowing for more engagement. I mean, if they fundamentally don't have the time to be a part of the conversation, and many of them don't, and many of them complained about this off the record, then they can't provide good guidance. They need to be able to work alongside an adaptive program. They need to understand the decisions that are being made, understand the risks that are being taken, and they need to be able to explain those to their own superiors. And if they simply don't have the time to do that, then they can't fulfill that function. And so if the donor field staff don't get more time to substantively engage, we are not going to be able to adaptively manage a lot of the programs that we're trying to do. Not quite sure how to do that. Lucho says amen. But it's worth flagging. This is a critical piece. Another one is allowing more ambiguity in proposal budgets. It would be great if we could just ask for a check for $15 million along with a technical proposal, but that's not going to work. Lacking that, the ability to reserve funds in a sort of to be determined line. In the past, I've called that like an innovation facility. There are other terms that people use. They end up being sort of couched in terms of like a flexible fund that's useful for sort of emerging priorities. The more we can be ambiguous and general in our proposal budgets, the more freedom we have to implement. And then lastly, as Karri discussed, reconsidering how we hire leadership positions. Team leaders, chiefs of party, project directors, we need to think a bit more broadly about the skill sets that we want to see for people in these positions, and they don't need to be technical geniuses or even really technical experts. They need to be excellent managers, and then we need to hire for technical expertise down beneath those positions. And then lastly, just to finish off with an example of a hypothesis-based plan, I apologize for the fact that this slide is extremely difficult to read, and I hope that you can all zoom in on it a little bit to make it a bit easier. But this is an example that that I've been working on with the MAID program up in northern Ghana, run by Nathan and ITAD, and Market Share provides M&E and adaptive management support to that program. And so what we were trying to do was come out with the sort of the minimum sketch of an intervention that we needed to be able to get to the end of a season and have the information we needed to be able to decide whether or not this was working. So it's Marcus had asked, I think in a few comments up about the difference between a log frame and a results chain when it came to hypothesis-based planning. So this is essentially like the lower half of a results chain. It doesn't move beyond the outcomes. It doesn't try to tie interventions into a broader vision of poverty reduction. It simply says, okay, if we're trying to build extension services into the commercial operations of aggregators in northern Ghana, these are the things that we need to track in this first season to see whether or not this is a reasonably good idea. And so it effectively maps out the process from partner identification to the completion of the season with the purchase of output by the aggregators and looks to see whether that was cost effective, whether there was a corresponding change in yield that would make it worth the extra investment by the aggregator, etc. And so you could use this for any intervention. And it's just going back to the idea of moving from adaptive management as we're flexible toward adaptive management as we are purposefully experimenting because we recognize that we cannot be effective unless we iterate our way into effectiveness with a relatively rigorous process. It also should provide for more rigor in donor involvement because you can see that you could picture the donor representative being heavily involved in decisions at the beginning of this process, in thinking through what the hypothesis would look like, getting agreement on what a green light or what information indicates a positive pilot versus information that indicates a negative result, and then coming in at the end of the process for the next decision point. And so it could make it easier for the donor to be more heavily involved in an adaptive process by structuring the points at which the donor comes in for a more substantive engagement and a sort of yes or no decision about what it is they would like to be doing. So with that, we'll close the presentation and move on to Q&A.
Yeah, hi. Thanks a lot to Karri and Tim for the presentations. I would like, from the perspective of the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, maybe summarize a few of the insights we have seen from this presentation, and then I would also like to say a few words about how SDC looks at the whole issue of adaptive management. So let me say, first of all, I think it's very essential and important that we discuss about this topic here today. It is, in my opinion, if I look at this presentation, there are at least 5 important issues which we can draw from it. And the first one for me would be that important is that adaptive management is not just changing haphazardly something in the project, but it would be a purposeful experimentation, like we have seen on one of the first slides. So it's not just running around in the field doing things in an uncoordinated or not very well thought through manner, but it would be a purposeful experimentation to achieve better results. And what is also important that we still have all our rules and in tendering and then also in the implementation from a donor side, which they are there, but it's not about bending these rules, but it's rather about knowing and also understanding these rules, and maybe, if I can say so, maybe also interpreting these rules. So I think both sides, donor offices and implementers, have to learn to look at these rules not as enemies, but rather as enablers for doing adaptive management. Thirdly, and probably the most important one, in my opinion, is the leadership issue. If I look, for instance, at the country level, you in fact need, I would call that, brave people. So people who invest time and energy to challenge the usual way tenders are done, or challenge the usual way how programs are monitored, or challenge the usual way how programs are steered, and are brave enough to do things differently. And it was rightly mentioned by the presenters, it's a lot around the intercultural aspects also. I think it's not always easy for local staff in implementer and donor offices to advocate for adaptive management. And I think that's a responsibility, especially from the management in these organizations, to actually reward such behavior. So it's important to have a communication which makes it clear to staff that if they come up with, for instance, what was said, like, okay, we have made a mistake here and we're proposing how to do it differently, so they don't get punished for that, but they actually get rewarded, or at least that can be discussed. And then last, maybe as a 5th point, an important, or how to say, a problem I also see often is that there is a disconnect between finance and program. I see clearly earlier when I worked for an implementer. I see it also now when I work in a donor office. It's as if these two were enemies to each another. Well, they should not be. So when writing a bit, or when assessing a bit, or when implementing, or when steering, finance and admin should actually be our supporters. I mean, we should see them as solutions, like it was said in the presentations, and not necessarily as those who put unnecessary barriers in front of ourselves. Lastly, maybe one more thing I want to add is, I think it was Tim who was saying it would be great if the donor field staff would have more time to engage in the programs. I agree with that. Would be really nice, but the reality goes completely the opposite way. As you all know, there is a heavy pressure on ODA, and there's a heavy pressure also on our overhead, meaning how much staff or how many people we can have in the local offices. So I don't see that happening in the next few years, I guess, at least. Now, if I can still have maybe 2 or 3 minutes to say what do we in SDC think about adaptive management. I mean, it's for me not a surprise that adaptive management comes out of market systems development programs, and in a way we are also hoping that maybe this will also inspire other types of projects we are doing. But still, at the beginning, I would like to maybe say a few points why things are not so easy to change. First of all, the quest or the demand for quantitative data will not go away. In contrary, it will probably even become stronger. We have a lot of the countries in Europe, we have right-wing parties or more right-leaning parties who demand a lot from us, from us as donors. We need to justify what we're doing abroad, and this is not possible without qualitative data or without numbers. So I don't think that will be possible to say, okay, we give up on the number demand. It's a question of accountability towards the taxpayers also, which is, in my opinion, a legitimate thing. I mean, eventually it's the taxpayers who are paying for these projects, so they must know what is being happening. And then again, because of the shifts in Europe, there's also cuts of ODA budget, so there's also more pressure on what are we delivering with less money. Another issue which can be a hindrance for adaptive management in SDC or in other organizations, and it was talked about, is the leadership. So we have, of course, in management, people who are very busy with many things, and for them an M4P or a market systems development approach is just one of the approaches among a dozen, and they may not always have the time to fully understand what is being done in such a project. So it is very much a question, how can that be brought across so that also higher ups can easily grasp what is being done in such a project. It was proposed in the presentation also that log frame should be replaced. For all those of us who are in development for quite some time, this is not the first time that we hear that. Log frame should be abolished, has been called for repeatedly in the last few decades. People have also argued we have now fear of change. We don't need log frames anymore. I honestly speaking don't believe log frames will disappear. But I think what is an interesting option which was presented, that we could say, okay, log frames we need for accountability, and we have maybe other tools for like explaining the change, what's happening in our projects, and also for then steering our projects in an adaptive manner. Now, if I mentioned in the presentation, SDC has developed a guide on how to manage MSD M4P projects, so that leads you basically from the very beginning of project idea all the way to the evaluation. And I think what I hear at least from many people, this is a useful instrument. We use it quite actively, I would say, in the country offices. and it's a unique document in a way because it's not a guideline, so it's not binding, but it's a collection of ideas how to understand procurement rules, how to understand reporting rules, and how to make better use of that. So I would only encourage others maybe to also have a look at this guide. Now a few last points. I think an important issue for SDC, what we try to stimulate is also that we have alliance between the staff in our country office and the implementers in the field. So in the end, if the communication works, if the country office and the implementers speak in one language to each another, then things are much more easier to achieve, and adaptive management is also easier to do. It needs an open, transparent communication, basically. The issue of reporting, or the issue of accountability more at the outcome level, is something which also SDC would like to see more. We have been talking about that for at least 10 years, if not more, and we're pushing also in our log frames and in our reports for more outcome level reporting. That needs, of course, good indicators. But in the end, I mean, how you get to the outcome should not be the main question. And lastly, maybe I think for SDC very important is also the finding, and something we have also realized, that a team leader doesn't have to be a technical expert. A team leader should actually be an excellent manager. And I'm now a bit maybe provocating here, but I would say it's even okay if he doesn't understand anything about M4P, as long as he is a good manager and he has a team of portfolio managers who then are the M4P cracks. So with this, over to Emma.
Thank you. I'd just like to start by saying thank you for such an illuminating presentation. I think it was a snapshot of the really rich information in your report. And I hope people on the webinar will come away inspired to read it, because it's got brilliant depth and texture and some fantastic quotes that I know we couldn't get at. One of the opening comments in the report is that there's a thirst to know about what other organisations are doing, and I think the number of people registered here, that's clear. And there's obviously a lot of experience online. But just speaking to that, I wanted to give you a quick overview of some of Mercy Corps' experience of adaptive management as implementer. So, like you, we have been delving into this and going through a market development lens into adaptive management that we've now kind of broadened out. And we wondered what the constraints and enablers of adaptive management are. So we came together with IRC to form ADAPT, which was trying to understand the field-grounded realities of what adaptive management looks like. So as part of this partnership, we conducted 6 case studies into programs in a diverse range of complex contexts. And we've produced a report, just a short 10-pager called Adapting Aid, and that's available on the Beam website if you search for it. Now, we pulled out 5 key themes. I won't go into them now, but they're in the report, and they really resonate with your analysis. So a few key reflections from that related to the report. On knowledge, we concentrated, I think, on the context analysis or information from intervention side, as you described it, and we called that theme appropriate analysis. And we also added another theme, responsive decision-making and action, to get at the fact that information alone is not enough if we don't use it. So really trying to pull out that part about acting on decision-making. So although we were concentrating on the kind of contextual piece, the use of knowledge can really be translated, I think, to the understanding the rules part that you highlight. And one example that perhaps comes through in your presentation and one of the questions a second ago was, it was fascinating to me that ODI noted last week that although the DFID SMART rules now mean that programs don't have to use a log frame at all, and I think many people are aware of this, they said that not one proposal has been submitted since that does not include a log frame. So I think that goes again to the distance that you can have between having information and using it. And limited to the use of knowledge, linked to the use of that, sorry, it came through really clearly in the ADAPT cases that to use information, you really need decision making to be as close to the ground as possible. We know that those who are closer to a problem probably understand it more and they're better positioned to try new things and to see whether they're working and iterate and change them. So that depends on country teams having both trust, and I know you've talked about trust quite a bit in the report, and autonomy, which I think is important. So a question for you would be, what did you find some of the most important factors in your research for turning the knowledge into action? Very quickly on culture. Culture is so clearly critical to whether programs can be adaptive, and I love how you've separated out the different levels of culture, and I think it's really important to be aware of these. I thought the same for the sort of thoughtful way you'd pulled out the different levels of leadership too. Like you said, culture's so closely intertwined to leadership and the capabilities of a team. In our ADAPT analysis, we called this bucket dynamic teams, but I think it actually works really well to separate this out. But considering that culture of adaptive management is dependent on things like personalities, on the capabilities of the team and the national culture, how do you think that organisations can really foster adaptive management? Just really quickly on what we're trying at Mercy Corps to do, we're trying to think about how we can sort of link pockets of excellence and really institutionalize this, how we can structure our incentives to do more, our internal incentives. Following the lead of corporates like Spotify, one thing we've been working on is a culture deck that articulates what Mercy Corps culture is, and we've developed this and tested it with field programs, and that puts adaptive capacity at the heart. And then bearing in mind that bit about the capabilities, we're using an adaptive management lens in our revision of our cornerstones of leadership. And that starts articulating the qualities that we'll start hiring against and measuring performance. So we can really try and promote that. The last point, there's a movement to try and shift the industry, I think, to enable and, importantly, to incentivize more adaptive management. And I think it's really interesting to think about how that might happen. One thing you mention in the report is that tenders rarely ask for evidence of a proposing party's adaptive capacity during the bidding process. And I was wondering if that's actually the answer either, or how we could do that. Because I understand that DFID has got actually an adaptive tick box that they can use or tick when they're evaluating business cases. But any evaluation criteria on adaptive capacity perhaps risks having a winning paragraph kind of recycled through proposals, which might win the money, but we don't know whether the organisation is really really adaptive. So if that's the case, considering the importance of these intangible things like culture and leadership and personality, how do you think donors can evaluate an organisation's adaptive capacity?
Emma, thanks very much. That's so much interesting insights from all of our speakers. So thanks to everyone. Just to say, I know we're pushing on for time, so if it's fine, we'll probably add 5 or 10 minutes, but no more to that at the end of the webinar. So we've had the great presentation, then some great further questions and ideas thrown in. We received a lot of questions so far, so it's a difficult job for myself to try and kind of bunch those and find out what are the questions that we have. So sorry if I don't answer them all, and if I'm not saying people's names. I'm just trying to find the questions that come up the most. The first question, though, is actually one that we received in advance, which is what M&E methods and tools. I mean, there's a lot of questions about tools available around management. Particularly, the question here, though, from Jenny Jorgensen from Lund University is what M&E methods and tools can complement adaptive management approaches. And asking this gives me a chance to bring in Ben from Market Share Associates, who can shed some light here.
Great. Thank you, Ashley. I think it's a very good question. and the desire to find tools that can help us manage more adaptively was certainly a common theme throughout the research. In terms of tools regarding results measurement, one of the things that stood out for us strongly was the potential role of results chains. Essentially, we need a way to refer back to what Tim was saying, have a way to outline really what are those testable experiments that we're doing. So being really intentional about what actually we're trying to see to know whether it's happening or not. And results chains can be a really helpful way to do that, of actually outlining the paths that you're expecting to see, and even outlining alternative pathways, recognizing that you may not get it on the first go. And so having multiple ways that you might be able to achieve the same objective, or multiple ways that that change process might happen. So I think we saw that there was a particularly powerful role for that tool in outlining the pathway. But then there's another whole set of tools which can be helpful, and those are, to refer back to the point that was just made by Emma about how do you actually use the information, is the tools that can actually facilitate taking the information and guiding the learning that happens. So, for example, things like pivot logs, which help you actually log it and actively reflect upon what you're seeing and when you're taking new decisions, or how you're going to use the information that you have received to make decisions. Or trigger points, which is when you in advance identify the information and the points at which time you actively need to look at what's happened, and where really a piece of information is going to be really important to help you decide on whether you need to maintain the pathway that you're on or take a new tack. Those types of tools around the actual utility are just as important as outlining what you're anticipating is going to happen via the pathway. So to sum up, I'd say those are some of the key tools that we've seen and have found people are finding helpful, but I think that there is certainly a lot of room out there as well for additional experimentation and development of tools that can help us to improve upon that even further.
Thanks very much, Ben. Okay, I'm going to move on. If any of the other presenters want to add something, please just jump in. But we have a few questions, and we'll try to share them around. Can I pass over? Maybe Tim, you could start off a brief conversation here, and others can join in. I mean, there's been several comments around the position put forward by yourself and Karri around rethinking the log frame and separating out the two uses. Could you tell us a bit more about that, and see if you can give some responses to the questions?
Yeah, sure. Again, it goes to the issue of the fact that we're trying to fulfill two very distinct purposes with the same tool. Sirocco mentioned this as well. You have to have a mechanism for accountability, and the log, first and foremost, the log frame is a mechanism for accountability. But in the course of filling it out, it asks you to define your mechanism of accountability in a way that matches your theory of change, and so it should start with your basic outputs. Those should logically lead up to the outcomes you expect to result from them, and then up into your final impact. And so that second stricture, or that second constraint, is the problem. The fact that when we're asked to define a mechanism of accountability that is appropriate to the program, we're asked to do it in a way that embodies the theory of change. And if we are working in a way that requires us to adjust our theory of change as we learn more and become progressively better at achieving what we're intended to be doing, then the theory of change needs to be shifting, and the log frame, because it is twin to the theory of change, has to shift with it. And that's where you get into a lot of challenge, a lot of programs talking about the time it takes to change a log frame, the fact that you don't even want to go through the process because it's so difficult, and so you'll just stick with the log frame as it is, losing the opportunity to move into new areas, or to have the log frame speak to all of the activities that a program is doing. So some programs, when they're trying to be experimental, when they're trying to iterate, will just start doing things that don't even feed into the results framework that they've already developed. So if we can pull those two things apart and we can say, okay, we have a mechanism for accountability that embodies, that looks at outcomes and above, then that can be one. It doesn't have to be a log frame format. It doesn't have to be anything but a piece of paper and a few bullet points. And that can serve the purpose of the mechanism of accountability. And then in terms of how we define a theory of change, if we need an overarching theory of change for a program, then we can develop one. But in my experience, an overarching theory of change for a program is not useful to a program itself. What's useful to a program itself are the smaller results chains, which are theories of change about what happens within a particular market system as a result of a specific intervention. And so for that second purpose, actually we're already fulfilling it with results chains. And if we move into a more explicitly hypothesis-focused intervention design strategy, then we have abbreviated results chains that would be fulfilling that purpose. And so then we wouldn't have to, we could just stop trying to develop larger, sort of all-encompassing theories of change for reasonably sized, multifaceted adaptive program, because it doesn't really serve the purposes of any constituency across the donor implementer spectrum.
Just to add to what Tim's been saying, I think what we really need to do is find a tool or a set of tools or adapt our existing tools to recognize that there are many paths to the top of the mountain. If being accountable is, did you make it to the top of the mountain? What we need are tools that say, you can take the west route, the east route, you can go across the mountain, which you didn't expect to, as long as it's always clear that you're on a path that is heading to the top. And right now I think, and this is also the way we use our tools, it's not entirely the tool's fault, we write them and then we act as though they were written in stone. And that is both a donor interpretation, who they don't want to change their, what they've got in their system, and an implementer, I don't have time to do this, I'm busy doing the project, I don't have time to change my log frame. So our relationship with these tools, whatever they may be, also needs to change.
If I can add here, I mean, from my side, from SDC side, what we observe is also that a lot of the theory of change we get, let's say in a bid or proposed by an implementer, these are just not more than a vertical log frame. So it's also a question, why are the implementers not using more, let's say, the freedom they would have to actually really develop a proper theory of change, which of course has to have a linkage with a log frame, but it doesn't have to be just a copy-paste in a vertical format. The other thing I wanted to say, and I can only speak on behalf of SDC, not all donors, I mean, for us, a project document is a living document, so log frames are not cut in stone. So it's a question of having in a log frame outcomes which make clear what you want to achieve with the program, but which are also open enough so that you have more flexibility in implementation. And then at the output level, it's again a question of how you formulate that so that you later have the possibility to change something while you are implementing. And last but not least, we do in all programs also midterm review, and during a midterm review, a log frame can be adjusted. So I don't see that the log frame as such is
Hi, thanks very much, Sokka. I think we're just testing your microphone, so I'll come back to you in a second. Maybe just a couple more questions. There's a couple that have come in that seem to really be around, I mean, they're different, but they're around the management side. So from Miriam and from Lawrence, they say, interested to hear more thoughts on hiring leaders for more management skills versus technical skills. Do you think technical skills are essential to be able to make more sound decisions? So a bit around the picking of leaders. Great to get some responses there. And we're also asked, and great if we can get Sirocco back to this, considering the importance of such intangible factors, how can donors evaluate an organization's adaptive capacity? So how are you able to know whether or not your implementer is able to have this capacity? Can I open those up to the floor?
Yeah, I can jump in on the second one there, the importance of intangible factors and how donors can evaluate an organization's adaptive capacity. I think asking for evidence of learning, and so three basic questions. They would be good for a quarterly report, or good for asking about whether an organization is really up to capacity to be able to run an adaptive program. Is in a given situation, what isn't working? What have you tried that's not working? And then what have you learned from that? And then how is the learning translated into better programming? I think a lot of times with like success stories, quarterly reports, etc., we can say a lot of things that make us sound fantastic and like we're making a lot of progress, and it's very difficult to refute. But it's very difficult to fake responses to those three questions. What isn't working? What have you learned from that? And how is that learning translating into better programming? With that simple set of questions, you can dig quite deeply into the degree to which a program is really sort of profoundly struggling with the questions of their work. And you could also look at a program's or a prospective implementer's adaptive capacity. And then for doing assessments, for doing reviews, one thing that we've done when asked to participate in external reviews as systemic change advisors, one thing that's worked very well for us at MarketShare is to look at evidence of learning. If you've gone in as an external reviewer to look at a program focused on systemic change that's halfway through the life of a 5-year program, you shouldn't expect to see a lot of systemic change. You shouldn't really expect to see any systemic change. But that doesn't mean that you can't evaluate the likelihood that a program is going to be able to achieve systemic change, and that comes down to looking at evidence of learning. And you can look across different programs, and you can see significant distinction between the energy and level of iteration that you find on a given program. And I think that stands as a reasonable proxy for any given program's adaptive capacity.
And let me just build on that. I think as a pre-step to the evaluating of a particular program, one thing that donors or other kind of neutral bodies can do in an area is have fail fests. I recently went to Steep Network's conference, and they had a fail fest, and I thought it was an effective forum. In our, as Tim was saying, in our quarterly reports, we want to talk about all the great stuff we did, and inevitably you are doing great stuff, and people are working hard. So you have to kind of turn it on its head and create an incentive for people to talk about their failures as something positive because you learned from it. And one of the ways to do that is take it out of that reporting space and move it into some other context. And so, going back to the points we've been making about culture, if you're trying to create an environment in which people are willing to talk about what didn't work and then what they did about it, there's also this responsibility of the kind of donor community to go, come on, everybody, show us what you've got, but about the failures instead of about the successes. And I just think that's almost a pre-step to creating the environment in which you then can actually start evaluating appropriately because people are open to talking about it.
Just very shortly from my side, from SCC. Yeah. So for us, I mean the thing which was just said now by Karri, I think, is important, that we should try to create more spaces where we can talk about failures, and I fully agree that an annual report is a very bad place to do that. It's very difficult for an implementer to write about failures in an annual report. I don't think we have in SEC found already the perfect solution for that, but that's certainly something to ponder about. What we are also trying out, or what we have tried out, for instance, in the office I'm working currently, we have now asked in the tenders that when we ask for project references, for examples of projects, that we also ask for an external review report. And then if you go into these review reports, you also see what capacity does a bidder have to actually adapt to context changes, and how are they dealing with challenges of all sorts which are appearing in the program.
Okay, thanks very much. I want to. So we're getting nearly to 10 past, so I'm gonna draw a line here. Can I just finally ask our presenters before we end the webinar? Is there like anything you feel you really want to say but you didn't have a chance to say? Just jump in if there's anything. If not, that's fine.
Honestly, there is so much more. I couldn't possibly say it in 2 minutes, but I'm really encouraged that all of you are here and having what is clearly in the chat an interesting dialogue. And I think most of all, that's what Tim and Ben and I wanted to create, was this ongoing dialogue. And I know it was Beam's hope as well. So let's just keep the dialogue going in all the different fora that we are interacting.
I would add on that note that one of the things that we observe in the report is that there's no single organization that really embodies this. There's no donor that really embodies it. There's no implementer that really embodies it. There are a lot of us who are making more or less progress. But what there really is, if you look across, as we looked across the field, what we saw was there are little battles being waged in nearly every organization, and what I think what's great about what Beam is trying to do here is trying to knit all of the insurgents together, and so the more we can draw upon each other and encourage each other and publicize not only the appeal but the feasibility of taking an adaptive approach to dealing with the problems that we try to address in our work, the more successful we're going to be. So, on the one hand, it's kind of disappointing to see that there's still so much to be done, but on the other hand, we all found it very encouraging to talk to so many people who were so keen to see this happen.
So I have talked about leadership and said how important that is, and as a closing statement, I would like to remind all of us who are now in this talk today. Leadership doesn't mean it's just your boss. I mean, leadership actually, in my opinion, it means that all of us who are believe that adaptive management could be a better way to do programming, then we also have to do something about it. So it's a question of each of us doing at his own or her own level what he can to bring such a change. So thank you very much, everybody.
Okay, everyone. Well, thanks very much. Thanks for those great comments. So with that, I want to draw the webinar to a close. Thanks so much you all for joining and the great questions. Sorry we couldn't answer them all, but thanks for all the conversations. Some people I know we didn't get around to responding to Lauren's, Anna, Waterlove, Thomas, Robbie and James, and many other people. I can see as well we have new, and Waterlove, we have new terminology coming up in the chat area. So thanks to you all. We really do want to work with these. And of course, in particular to our speakers for the fine job they have done. They really put a lot of time in, and they're volunteering their time, so we're very grateful to them. Our evaluation form will pop up when you close this. It's very short. We really appreciate you fill it in. I do speak to my colleague Sarah straight away to say, what did they say? What did they say? So please fill it in. We do use it. The presentation, recording, and the research will be available on the Beam website, and we will email that out as well. As I said earlier, any questions you feel are unanswered, you can see all of the email addresses of the speakers here, and also you can ask on the Beam LinkedIn page. But perhaps more importantly here, as I mentioned earlier, and this is the start of something. This is the work that started by Tim, Ben, and Karri is really about, and the work Beam wants to keep on doing is about building up this network amongst us, and it's about kind of sharing good practice amongst us. So it is the start of a journey that is very important to Beam. And as I mentioned earlier on, we have a new initiative around people, yourselves, sharing your emerging good practice on some key challenges. So if you have a time, I would really appreciate if you could have a look at that. I think hopefully we will share the link again, or you'll see it shortly. That leaves me with nothing more to say. Just have a great rest of the day. I look forward to being in touch in the future. Thanks very much. Bye.